sorry for the delay. Hi. So one of the amazing things about speech is just how much information is crammed into this signal, the single 1D signal. So I think when we think about speech production, what we think of most of the time is a situation where a speaker is thinking of a particular word because they have a concept they want to communicate, say the word cat. So they're thinking about a cat, they want to tell someone else about it. So they think, they sort of look the word up in their mental dictionary. They look up what the speech sounds are that are associated with that word. They figure out the mouth and vocal tract movements they need to make to produce those sounds, and then they actually produce them. And what comes out is something like this, basically a collection of acoustic cues consisting of variation of a few things, pitch, duration, and spectral content. And then the receiver needs to analyze this signal and then extract the original speech sounds which the speaker was intending to communicate to figure out the intended meaning. And this is definitely going on, obviously, when people talk, and this is itself already a complex process, but there's a lot of other kinds of information in speech simultaneously. So on the other hand, there's also information in speech about whether a syllable is stressed or not stressed, at least in English, and also information about whether a word is emphasized or not emphasized, or the location of phrase boundaries. Obviously, there's other ways you can detect phrase boundaries based on your knowledge, already existing knowledge of grammar, but there's also sound cues in speech to where these phrase boundaries are as well. In addition to all this linguistic information, there's also information in the signal that's somewhat less linguistic in nature. So characteristics of the speaker, for example, just by listening to me, you'd be able to tell roughly how old I am, whether I'm male or female, some approximation of my emotional state, things like that. And all of these dozens of types of information are all simultaneously present in this signal, which again is really just a 1D signal. So on a very basic level, it's just changes in amplitude over time. So how is this possible? Well, there's a couple features of speech that make this compression of information possible. One is that these different types of information are communicated across different time frames. So at the level of individual speech sounds, this is occurring at a much smaller time frame on the order of 40 to 50 milliseconds per unit. On the other hand, something like word emphasis is happening at a much slower time scale, on the order of maybe 500 milliseconds per unit. So that's one thing that makes this possible. Something else that makes this possible is that any given one of these features tends to be communicated by multiple acoustic cues or dimensions. And the reason why that's an important characteristic of speech is that it means that if any one of these types of features is obscured for some reason, the effects are not catastrophic. So if for some reason you have trouble perceiving the pitch of a particular spoken utterance, that doesn't mean you can't get this information. It just means that you will have to get it from other sources. So to illustrate what I mean, let's focus on one of these types of information a little more. So let's look at the acoustic cues to grammatical phrase boundaries. And this is in English. This does vary a bit across languages. But in English, there are two main cues that people can listen for to detect the location of phrase boundaries in speech. Where here, phrase boundary basically means where would the comma be. And the two main cues are pitch variation just before the phrase boundary. So there tends to be a large pitch movement just before the phrase boundary, and also durational lengthening. So the word and the syllable just prior to the phrase boundary tends to be a little longer. And you can see that in this example here. So these are spectrograms of audio recordings of a voice actor reading this phrase after John runs the race in two different ways. One in which there's a phrase boundary in the middle, and one in which there's a phrase boundary at the end. And you can see here two things have happened. So the blue trace here is the pitch of the word, and you can see in the case where runs is just before a phrase boundary, there's a larger pitch movement than when it's not just before a phrase boundary, when the pitch is relatively flat. And the opposite is true for race. When it comes just before a phrase boundary, again, there's a large pitch movement, and not when there's not a phrase boundary there. So that's one cue. And then you can also see that the word tends to be longer just before when there's a phrase boundary present. So I don't have a recording of this, but it would sound something along the lines of, after John runs the race, versus after John runs the race. I'm exaggerating that a bit more than in the way that these cues would be present in natural speech, and just to make it a little easier to hear. Okay, so what this means is that there's a lot of useful information in speech. There's all these different acoustic cues that are varying and telling you something about linguistic structure at multiple different levels simultaneously. And this is really useful, but it also poses a kind of interesting and difficult problem, which is that when you're acquiring language, how do you figure out that these categories are present in the first place? And how do you learn to map on this acoustic variation to these linguistic categories? And this is something that psychologists and linguists have been talking about a long time, both as it applies to acquisition of one's first language and as it applies to acquisition of a second language. And one recent computational kind of formal model of how this works was this paper from 2010. And I'm not going to go into the mathematics, I'll give you just sort of a cartoon of how this works. But according to this theory, basically, people are kind of amateur statisticians when they're learning about language structure through speech. What they're doing is they're acquiring knowledge about the distribution of these different auditory cues. And what that means is they're trying to figure out, are certain values more common than others? And this is abstract here, but these could be any of a variety of cues, maybe the pitch of a word, or this could be voice onset time, or any of a number of things. But basically what happens is that whatever this is, it's going to kind of vary across any unit of input that a listener is getting. So for example, this might be the pitch measured across many thousands of iterations of times when people are hearing words. And what listeners are listening for, what they're looking for is the shape of this distribution, and in particular how many peaks there are. The idea being, if there's only one peak, that suggests there's only one category being mapped onto this particular acoustic feature. If there's more than one peak, in this case, in all four of these examples there are two, that means that there might be two linguistic features present that are mapped on to this auditory cue. So that's, according to this model at least, fundamentally what listeners are trying to figure out as they're learning about language through speech. Not only that, but according to this model, this process of learning about language through speech can be faster or slower depending on how useful a particular cue is. So cues are more useful if these peaks are farther apart, and they're also more useful if the width of these peaks is narrower. And that's because if these distributions don't overlap, you can very quickly figure out that there are two peaks there, even if you haven't had that much input. But if they're closer together, you would need to get really reliable information about the shape of this distribution to be able to notice that there are two peaks there. So formally, this model then goes on to say, well, when you're trying to figure out about language structure, what you'll end up doing basically is placing more importance on dimensions for which the peaks are further apart and for which the peaks are narrower. Now, one important assumption of this model, and really most work on how these processes work, is that it treats all language learners as being more or less equivalent. It suggests that people get the same input as they're acquiring language and that they do the same fundamental things. But that's not necessarily true, because one thing we know about listeners is that they seem to vary a lot in the amount of noise in these different perceptual channels. And when I say perceptual channels here, it's kind of a vague concept from psychology, but it basically means different acoustic dimensions, in this case, from which you can extract information. So things like the pitch of a sound or the duration of a sound. And there's been a lot of work in psychology showing that there are surprisingly very large differences between people in how accurately they can perceive these sound attributes. But basically, if you measure the amount of noise in these different channels, some people seem to have higher levels of internal noise than others. Noise that's sort of added by the normal function of their nervous system. Brains are very noisy machines. They're not like computers. They don't do the same thing all the time. Neurons are constantly firing even when they're getting no inputs. So brains are relatively noisy, and some people seem to have noisier brains than others, and that seems to be the case. It kind of varies independently across different auditory channels. So, how might this affect language learning? Well, the way it could be incorporated into this model is basically by modeling it as increases in the width of these distributions. And what that might do is that it might cause these bimodal distributions to overlap more. And according to this model, what that would do, it would delay the acquisition of knowledge about these different language categories. So basically what this would predict, it would predict that people for whom perception is noisier would take a little longer to learn about language. Now importantly, it would suggest they would eventually, after they've gotten the right inputs, still arrive at the same destination as the people with less noisy perceptual systems. It might just take them a little longer. So this is fundamentally one of the main hypotheses that Kazuya and I have been testing as we've gone about examining second language acquisition and auditory processing in a few different populations. So that's how we've been testing this hypothesis. We've been measuring kind of perceptual noise across different dimensions, and also how quickly people have been able to learn language as they've been exposed to a second language environment, to see if there seems to be any relationship between those two things. And we've done this across a few different data sets now, and we're publishing them individually, but for now, just for this talk, I'm going to collapse across them to see if there seem to be any consistent patterns across these different data sets. But if you want to know kind of more specifically and in more detail about these individual populations, this Polish population, the data from that is already published, and we're moving forward with the other ones as we speak. So one thing that these populations all have in common is that they haven't been in the United Kingdom for too long. So these are all speakers of Polish, Mandarin, and Spanish who came to the UK between 0.1 and 6 years ago and are now learning English. But besides that, they actually do vary along a number of different axes. So they have a variety of ages and a variety of ages of arrival. So what we had these participants do is we measured, again, the amount of noise in their perceptual systems. And we did this in two main ways. So the first way we did this was behaviorally. And we used a experimental method that's been used for a really long time in psychology, so since the 19th century, actually, to study perceptual noise. And the way this works is you present three sounds to a listener, and one of those sounds is always different from the other two. It might be the first sound or the third sound, and the task is very simple. It's just to say which of the three sounds was different. And the task is presented dynamically, so that when a person gets the answer right, it becomes a little more difficult. When the person gets the answer wrong, it becomes a little easier. And the idea is to find the threshold at which participants are just barely able to do this task, as basically a measure of how much noise is distorting this originally very clear signal as it's entering the auditory system. So first we measure this behaviorally. And why don't we stop there? Well, we also include neural measures of sound processing. And the reason for this is that auditory discrimination performance likely does reflect to a large extent individual differences in how much perceptual noise there is in the system, but it can also reflect cognitive aspects of a person's sort of individual differences profile. So for example, obviously, you're not going to do the task as well if you occasionally stop paying attention and then just have to guess because you weren't listening. And that's a simple example, but there's also a memory component as well, because you do have to encode the sound in memory in order to compare it to the other sounds. So there are probably several things contributing to performance in that task, and that's why we also included measures of auditory neural processing as a more pure measure of auditory processing. And then finally, we have some outcome measures, two measures of speech perception and one measure of grammatical knowledge, which I'll talk about more in a second. But first, a few more details about the auditory processing tests. So I already described the basic outline of how these tests work, so now I'll just play some examples and talk about the specific dimensions that we're testing. So one of these dimensions is pitch discrimination, and here's what the stimuli sound like. Hopefully this works. Again, the task here would be to say which of the three sounds is different. That worked a little too well. Just a second. Let me try that again. So there, the correct answer would be the third one. Yes. Okay. There was also a test of duration discrimination. So here are the three sounds different in length. And again, very simple task, just to say which is different. So PowerPoint always accidentally modifies the length of the things it plays, so it's always impossible to present stimuli from duration discrimination tests. They sound identical, but it shows in the first one. The third test was rise time discrimination, and what this means is it's how fast the sound increases in amplitude at the very beginning. And this is an important cue in speech because there's a lot of differences in sort of the rise and the speed of rise and fall of the amplitude of speech that could help convey things like whether a syllable is stressed. And that sounded like this. In that case, the correct answer was the first one. And then finally, there was a test of formant discrimination. And these sounds are almost speech-like. So they contain three different formants. They sound a bit like vowels, or they sound like rather artificial vowels. And it's the position of the second formant that's moving around between stimuli. So it sounds a bit like slight differences between vowels, and they are very artificial. And that one's a little harder than the other ones, but does anyone agree? Yeah. You all good? Okay, so now, as I said, performance in these tests likely does reflect to a large extent auditory processing skill, but it probably reflects a number of things as well. So to follow up on that and see if we can show more specifically a relationship between auditory processing and second language acquisition, we also collected something known as the frequency following response. And this is not as well known an EEG technique as other techniques out there, so I'm going to spend some time explaining how this works and what it is, and why we might want to use this to study individual differences in auditory perception. So this is an EEG technique, and basically what that means is when we record this response, what we're doing at a very basic level is attaching sensors to someone's scalp, and then using those sensors to measure the moment-by-moment change in electrical potential. So when we're doing this, and we have a participant in the lab, we can actually see this signal as it's coming in real time. So we'll see something like this, but of course it won't be static. Basically, this line will be moving up and down and kind of drawing itself in real time. And this will be showing us how the electrical signal on the scalp is changing, again, from moment to moment. And when we do this to collect this response, there's only one active electrode, meaning this signal is basically just coming from a single electrode. And what that means is that it's reflecting really an enormous number of things. So it's reflecting the contribution of millions of neurons, but it's also reflecting the contribution of things like electrical noise and muscle movement and other stuff like that we don't care about. So what we do to actually isolate the brain response is to present a single speech sound 6,000 times, and then to see what happens to the electrical signal after each sound presentation. So you can think of that as basically taking 6,000 lines that represent what happens after each sound presentation, and then kind of collapsing them all into a single response. And that looks something like this. So this is the average response we get from presenting this synthesized speech sound that sounds like da 6,000 times. And as you can see, this is a very rich, very complicated response. And it consists of sort of two main responses that are coming from two different parts of the brain. So there's a slow fall in rise and amplitude that looks like this. This, by the way, is about 200 milliseconds long. And that's coming from the cerebral cortex. And that's not the frequency following response. So that's not what we care about for our purposes here. So we can filter that out by just taking out the lower frequencies. And then we're left with a response that looks like this. So you can see that the slow changes have been taken out, and what we're left with are much more rapid fluctuations between peaks and valleys, and this is the frequency following response. So that's how it's collected. Why is it interesting? Why would we want to collect this in the first place? Well, the clue is in the name. It contains the same frequencies that are present in the stimulus. So it's basically what we're left with is a brain wave that resembles the sound wave in a lot of ways, but it resembles the sound wave better in some people than in others. And what we can then do is we can analyze the brainwave using some of the same tools you would use to analyze the sound to see how well certain aspects of sound are represented in the sound wave. So just for the purposes of time, let's focus on the right-hand graphs here. And this is looking at the stimulus and the response in the frequency domain. This is the response from a single participant. And what you can see here is that the stimulus contains, in particular, energy at three important frequencies. So the fundamental frequency at 100 hertz, this is the pitch, and then two formants or peaks in the spectrum at 700 and 1200. And we can find these same frequencies in the response as well. This is just the outcome of analyzing the data in two different ways. But you can see again the fundamental frequency here, and then the first and second formant here and here. So what we can then do is we can see whether people with a more robust, a stronger response at these three important frequencies, whether they've been more successful at acquiring knowledge of English. And finally, I'll briefly go over how the language tests worked. Both of the speech perception tests worked in the same basic way. Participants heard a single speech token and then mapped perception tests, one example being this.
Sad.
And then there was a word emphasis perception test, one example being this.
Mary likes to read books.
So in this case, they were asked whether they heard the first word or the second word as being emphasized, and then selected one or the other option. Finally, there was a test, a visually presented test of grammatical judgment. So this test didn't involve any actual sound perception, and it worked like this. Participants saw a sentence on the screen. It stayed there for 3 to 4 seconds, and then it went away, and participants were just asked to mark whether they heard, whether it was grammatical or ungrammatical. So basically what we found, and again I'm collapsing across several data sets here, but the consistent message across this data is that auditory processing does seem to be a pretty good predictor in people who have been in the UK for a few years, essentially. So there was a link between auditory processing and not just vowel perception, which is here, but also grammatical judgment. And these relationships are not amazingly strong, but they're about equivalent to the strength of the relationships we found with more traditional predictors like age of acquisition. And they did survive even when age of acquisition was included in the model. Now this relationship might seem particularly surprising, this relationship between auditory processing and grammatical judgment, because this was a visually presented test. And my explanation for this is, a potential explanation, is that there are these cues in the speech signal to the location of certain grammatical features like phrase boundaries. And in terms of evidence that might be the case, we did also find a relationship between auditory processing and prosody perception, the perception of word emphasis, and then a strong relationship between prosody perception and grammatical judgment. Now again, these auditory processing variables can reflect multiple things, including cognitive variables such as working memory and attention. So to see whether these relationships were specific, we also looked at the relationship between skill in these measures and the frequency following response. And we found for vowel perception a specific relationship with the encoding of one of the two formants. So that's what's being shown down here. These are the average responses in the half of the participants who were good at vowel perception and the half of the participants who were poor. And we found a different pattern for grammatical judgment. So grammatical judgment was more specifically related to neural encoding of the fundamental frequency or pitch and not to the higher formants. Okay, so I have less time than I thought I did, so I'll just stick with the first half of my talk, but this is good timing. But what we found is that precise domain general auditory processing helps drive successful language acquisition. And I will skip to the very end, the final implications I had that were related to this. So one possibility is that we might look into whether we could use auditory training to help speed up second language learning, to see if basically if it's possible to decrease noise in these perceptual channels, and in so doing potentially kind of prime people so they can more rapidly and more efficiently gain information from the linguistic signals they're surrounded in when they move to a second language environment. Thank you.